Bill Nykirk, economics correspondent for the Chicago Tribune. The Federal Reserve Board is expected to loosen credit so that interest rates will fall. Why is the Fed taking this action, and what kind of an impact is it going to have on consumers?
First, you assume that they're going to take the action. We don't actually know that. That was sort of leaked out last week, according to the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post. And a few others who've called around have gotten no actual confirmation of that. My sense that was probably either speculated by an administration official or some administration official had been told by someone at the Fed that this was going to happen. But, I mean, to go to your basic question, it will have a good effect on the U.S. economy. Right now, it looks like we're in a period where, right after the stock market crash of last October, a lot of goods weren't sold for the Christmas season. You get this huge pile-up of inventories, a lot of stuff, cars, for example, all kinds of clothing, all sorts of goods on the shelves which haven't been sold. This stuff has to be bought. And so if you reduce interest rates, you make borrowing more affordable, and you boost up the economy a little bit and help consumers buy this stuff. So that is going to be helpful if this occurs.
So the October stock market crash did or does have a direct impact on consumer confidence?
Oh, absolutely it did. Now the question is how much, really? People will tell you that the initial shock of the market had a bad effect on consumer spending and confidence for maybe a month or so. And then they began to see something of a pickup. But Christmas sales did not meet expectations. So businesses had ordered many of those goods for the Christmas season way back earlier in the year. So we're having goods that had been ordered, say, early back in 1987. There's some indication that consumer spending may have picked up in later part of December, and maybe even though January is a slow sales month, generally right after Christmas, there's hope that's picked up now. So this is an election year. One thing you got to remember. And one truism about the economy is the economy always looks good during the election year because the politicians want it to. Mm-hmm. This is also a Federal Reserve Board which has been appointed entirely by President Reagan. And the Fed likes to say it's not a political institution, but I think that is not entirely true, that they do read their election returns.
Going back to the point on the inventories, what industries specifically are affected by this inventory buildup, and what actions can they take to better the situation?
Well, one action they can take is to cut prices, and I think there are going to be a lot of sales out there. For example, Chrysler announced yesterday that it's going to offer rebates, very sizable rebates to consumers, and they've obviously got a great big backlog and lots of cars in the lots they want to get rid of. Question is whether this will be extended to Ford and GM, and will they follow the same kinds of rebates. Probably be a great incentive year for cars, again, and it's going to be a difficult year. They're going to have to do that to get people to buy. Clothing, I've heard, is also an area where there are a lot of backup of goods. I can't give you the specifics on the others, but you find these a lot at the retail level, and department store level.
Good morning once again. We have Bill Nykirk, who is the economics correspondent for the Chicago Tribune, with us, and we are going to be talking in this portion of our call about a variety of economic issues, including the Federal Reserve Board's action to loosen credit and what that means for consumers, the general state of the economy, growth versus recession, and how the state of economy plays in a campaign year, which we were touching on just a few minutes ago. Also, today is the first day of the Senate Banking Committee hearings on the October stock market crash. We'll take a look at some of the general issues there. So once again, join us this morning. The phone numbers are on the bottom of your screen, and go ahead and start dialing the phone numbers right now. Mr. Nykirk, are we headed towards a recession?
Well, I think there's a good possibility of it. I mean, I'm a journalist. I don't really know for sure. But the economists I speak with say there's a real danger of a recession this year. Most of them, I think the consensus probably is we'll skirt very close but won't hit the recession this year. Mm-hmm. And maybe next year is a different story. We'll have to see what happens. A lot depends on the interest rate issue that you've talked about. A lot happens on what happens in the Midwest, where we've seen a revival now in exports for the first time because of the lower dollar. And I think exports are going to carry this economy probably, and spending by businesses. And consumers not necessarily right now. We've got to get the inventory problem out of the way, and that will be sort of a drag on growth. It's a good possibility we could slide slightly into a recession the first part of this year. Most economists say will not be, if it happens this year, will not be one that will last a long time. If it happens, if it's delayed until 1988, it could be a much more severe recession. I've heard economists tell me that's a good thing we're having a slowdown right now.
And why would that be?
Because if we continue to grow as we have been growing the last 2 or 3 years or so, or the last 7 or 8 years since the '82 real bad recession. There is such thing as a business cycle. And if this inventory problem continues to grow and consumers continue to buy, and then we get into 1988 and and the inventory problem gets to be a little worse then, and credit tightens, people start to worry about the deficit, new president finally deals with the problem of the deficit, things slow down, you might have one which lasts a much longer time.
Going back to your point on exports, how is all of this affecting the trade deficit?
Well, I think there's going to be some improvement in the trade deficit. It's very large. It's going to be about $170 billion or so this year. We saw a turnaround in last month's figures, not last month's figures, but it's actually for the month before, because there's a lag of a month in reporting the figures. But it was down the range of $13 billion or so, and that's very, very good. And there's been an actual turnaround in the volume of exports. I mean, we are actually bringing in, we're selling more overseas, and we're also bringing in fewer volume goods than we were before. And the only reason that that thing is really as high as it was is because the lower dollar raises the price of those imports coming in. So that is going to improve over the next year, but it's not going to improve enough so that it really becomes tamed, so to speak, as an economic problem. So it's going to be around for a few more years, I think.
Do we know what the administration wants the Fed to do?
Oh, yeah.
We do?
Yeah, they would like for them to lower interest rates. And, in fact, Burl Sprinkle, who's the monetarist chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, has been quietly, or not so quietly, really lobbying the Fed to lower interest rates. He's felt that they've been too tight in the past 6 months or so. And there are some people who believe that the Fed actually caused the stock market crash, which we can get to in a moment if you'd like.
Okay. We have a call standing by from Pella, Iowa. Good morning. Go ahead, please.
Yes. My dad's a farmer, and I've never really understood that, like, the price of gasoline is equivalent to, I should say is not equivalent to the price of grain and livestock. I mean, several years ago, gasoline was 50 cents a gallon. The price of livestock is comparable to what it was then. Now, you're paying a lot more for gas, but we're not getting any more for our livestock or grain. And when the price of gasoline did fall, they compensated so the workers on these oil docks could still make money by raising the price of the fuel back up. Now, can't we raise a little bit of the prices so our farmers can still make a little bit on this?
All right, thank you.
Raise the price of grain, I
Yes.
presume he's talking about.
I think that's what he meant.
Well, that's a very controversial topic, of course, whether you want to raise the price of grain anymore, but I think that's the nature of price supports. And that's, I think that in the last 3 months of the year, the government spent about $9 billion or so on price supports and taking some of this grain stockpile. You raise an interesting point about what economists like to call relative prices. And, you know, a few years ago, that was nice when the price of oil and the price of gasoline was less relative to grain and so on. But the point of fact is, farmers are very productive. They produced a lot of grain. And, you know, success can spoil you at times. Not spoil you in the sense, but can hurt you, damage you. And when you get to be more productive, unfortunately, we have a very productive farm sector. On the other hand, you know what happened in our energy sector, and so prices naturally are going to go up. I don't know what to say to the gentleman. I guess this is the economic facts of life, and we're all going to have to learn to adjust to it.
Fairfax, Virginia. Good morning. You're next.
Hello.
Hello.
I would like to know if the $100 million of arms export by Lieutenant Colonel North was ever registered as export or anyone paid any taxes on it as income. I would like to know if the 50% of smuggling of the Amway Corporation into Canada, when they were charged with a $22 million tax fraud by the Canadian government, did Amway pay for the 50% export of their income, not only to Canada, but to all companies which they do business with?
All right, thank you.
I have no response to that. I don't know.
What's happening to personal savings?
The personal savings rate?
Yes.
It's been very, very low. And that's because in the past year or so, consumers are basically have been spending like crazy. We've been on a spending binge. And that collapsed after the stock market crash. And you can see why that happened, because consumer confidence went down. There was this tremendous feeling in the country that things were going to be better and this would last forever. And I think that's probably the primary reason the stock market went up so much in 1987. And now that we've had the stock market crash, we have seen a little uptick in personal savings. And that's good, actually, because that's one way to reverse the trade deficit. If we don't spend as much in 1988, we won't be buying as many imports. If we're not buying as many imports, well, then gradually that will reverse the trade deficit. It's a very painful readjustment the country is going through right now, but I think it's good for the country.
Las Vegas, Nevada, good morning.
Good morning. I want to ask your guest, did you happen to catch that speech that Felix Rohatyn made to the, I believe, the Economics Club of San Francisco, which C-SPAN ran 3 or 4 days ago?
No, but why don't you go ahead and give us the gist of it?
Well, I can certainly recommend you get a hard copy and have a look at it. I hope C-SPAN will rerun it. It was very excellent. No one would ever have believed that the Keynesian theory could have been carried to the extent which it has in the last 6 or 7 years.
All right, do you have a question today?
Well, that's my question. I do hope C-SPAN will rerun that program.
Probably this weekend, although I'm not certain at this point. It's too early to tell, too early in the week.
I'm a little familiar with his views, and
All
he
right.
has some interesting views about what he calls a casino economy, and that when he looks at the stock market, a lot of that is nothing more than interesting, this gentleman should call from Las Vegas. It's probably hidden for that reason, that we are in a sort of a casino economy, and a lot of the stuff we've seen in financial markets, Wall Street, and currency markets around the world have developed a speculative aura about them, and this is one of the primary reasons that we had the volatility and ultimately the crash.
Indianapolis, Indiana, good morning.
Good morning. I appreciate C-SPAN. It does a nice service for the country. I'd like to ask the gentleman there if he sees the interest rates trending down this year, and just noticed that the Veterans Administration lowered their interest rate, what they charge, and or guarantee, or whatever you want to call it. And I'd like to know if you see trending down in interest rates for VA loans. I myself am a disabled veteran, and I'd like to purchase a home, but that puts me on a very close payout of interest rate to what I can afford to buy, as you could well understand. And of course, every point of interest drops down, the better home I can buy. I'd appreciate it if you could help me out a little bit. Thank you.
Thank you.
I wish I could give the gentleman a direct answer, but I don't, like a lot of economists, they refuse to predict interest rates. Now, I don't know whether I want to get into that game or not. But as a general rule, I think with the economy being a little slower this year, interest rates will be down. People are not borrowing as much in general. And if the Fed injects more money into the economy, you will see a rise in interest rate. Now, here's the problem. As you go on later in the year, say, let's go into close to election time. It will be very fascinating to see what happens, because if the Fed, we're an international economy now. If the Fed starts lowering interest rates, that will have an effect on the dollar. The dollar may slide again, because that's interpreted as a lack of support for the dollar. If the dollar decreases in value, which is quite possible during an election year, then you will see some inflationary expectations begin to be generated out in the financial markets. And that in turn could have an adverse effect on interest rates later in the year. And there's some worry about that. I don't see that occurring for several months ahead, based on everything I've learned from speaking to economists who watch the situation on a daily basis. So I think it's safe to assume that short-term interest rates in particular will come down first. And then consumer interest rates always lag behind, because banks like to make profits in financial institutions, and I think one way to deal with these banks sometimes is to strike them for a while. That's probably what the gentleman wants to do. He probably wants to wait for a while, because they want to put these loans out, and then obviously they want to put them out at a higher rate. So If loan demand's soft, interest rates will go down. So I think maybe a little waiting game is perhaps good right now for consumers. Wait to see what happens, and then the rates will come down faster for consumers.
We're just looking at a piece in the Wall Street Journal. Decline in mortgage rates sparks sharp rise in demand for homes. And just a sentence or two from that piece. The ensuing October 19 stock market crash has proved so far to be a boon for housing. The Fed eased its grip on interest rates in the economy, particularly consumer spending, slowed down easing credit demand. And then Christian Hill also goes on to say rates also may bounce back up as home buyers surge into the market this spring.
That's possible. The thing about covering economics is you'll find someone with almost any opinion. And I mean, there's really all over the lot. And then there's a consensus opinion, which we always try to focus on, because what else do we have except for the consensus?
That's right. Stenton, Missouri, good morning.
Good morning. When you look at federal revenues over the last 20 years, I believe there was only 2 years where the revenues declined from the preceding years. Now we've been in the growing economy for better than 5 years. What do you see happening to these federal deficits that have been ranging from about $148 billion a year to $221 billion a year? When revenues, because of a slowdown in the economy, when revenues start to decline appreciably from the preceding year, what do you see happening to the federal deficit when we should have declining deficits during growing years, but we're not? What's going to happen when revenues decline appreciably over the coming years when we do get into a recessionary period?
Well, deficit's going to go up. That's a simple matter the gentleman raises, and that's one reason why you try, when you have a long recovery, when you try to get your budget in balance. Unfortunately, the deficit, I think, is still out of control. Our defense spending and our social spending is strictly, absolutely do not match the revenue base that we have and you're right, we have had a growing economy. Taxes have been cut. However, we have not seen the supply side generation of income that everyone expected. Maybe Ronald Reagan will be lucky and Republicans will be lucky, and that will occur because the tax cuts are just going to be fully into effect, and the tax reform bill is going to be fully into effect this year and next. I don't think it's going to happen. I think there's going to have to be some reduction in the defense budget, perhaps an increase in some sort of tax. It's not an income tax that will help cut this gap. And there again, there's a trade-off, because as soon as you start raising taxes, you start taking purchasing power out of the economy, and you affect the growth rate on the other hand. So you take away from one hand and you sort of lose with the other. So it's very much a difficult game right now to solve this deficit problem. I think with the growing economy, I see the deficit staying about in the range of $160 billion or so. That's what most economists say. And there's going to have to be some more aggressive action by Congress to reduce the deficit. Probably that won't occur until next year after the election. So
the election year does complicate matters in terms of Congress's taking action.
Oh yeah, would you want to be a senator or congressman cutting the goodies during the election year? I wouldn't.
Seattle, Washington, good morning.
Yes, I have a little statement and question. 2 years ago, our currency was worth, I guess, about 45% more than it is relative to the foreign currencies. Right. At that time, the government wanted to lower the trade deficit, and thought by lowering the value of the currency they could accomplish this. Also, they wanted to balance the budget, which they haven't been able to do. So I have a solution question. Why not simply authorize the Federal Reserve to call in the notes that are outstanding from us, print the money, pay them off? This was, of course, devalue the currency, no question about it, but it certainly wouldn't have been more than 45% devaluation. It would have eliminated the interest payments, which would probably have balanced the budget. And they would accomplish everything at once. The deficit would be down. The currency would have been devalued, which is what they wanted so they could sell more. And we wouldn't have the interest payments. So we'd have a balanced budget. Why not simply do that and then not borrow any more unless it's a matter of war?
All right, thanks.
Interesting solution. I think you may have presented us a case for pretty rampant inflation there if you went all that far. that would be a way to do it, but that would certainly create a lot of inflation in the country. We still have a $160 billion deficit after all, and that what you're talking about, I think, is putting a lot of money into the economy, and you got to remember, devaluation of currencies does raise prices, we've managed to keep them around 4 or 5% or so in the past year, and I think we would have had maybe 7 or 8, maybe 10%, or maybe even more, and you would have had a tremendous loss of confidence in the currency if you did something like that. I think that's just much too drastic of a step. It's a solution, but it's so drastic that our trading partners would have just shrunk in horror at the whole thing, and that might even eventually have caused a depression, as a matter of fact. First you get inflation, then you get loss of confidence. So I think we have to be very careful about how these solutions all sound good, but we've got to be very careful about how we do it. We've got to do it in concert with our allies, and we've got to do it in an incremental kind of way and take sensible steps along the way.
Cleveland, Ohio, you're on with Bill Nykirk. Go ahead, please.
Yes, good morning.
Good morning.
I want to commend C-SPAN for giving information other than newspapers. I want to direct a question to the gentleman. If most of our large concerns are going overseas and having products developed with a lower wage and then shipping them back here, I presume to take advantage of the low wage or circumvent the union wage, whichever side of the coin you want to look at, who's going to have all this discretionary monies to buy these products, and aren't the inventories going to increase?
Well, first, just one small point about the inventories. It is true that a lot of the inventories, unsold inventories we see right now, probably a lot of those are imports. That's not bad. I mean, maybe that's a good idea that we don't buy as much of those. Another point on your point, you talked about low-wage countries. If you look at what a dollar devaluation does, it in effect makes American wages lower relative to the rest of the world by just lowering the price of your currency. It does the same thing as a low-wage, reducing wages in this country would do when you look at the final product of the goods. So in effect, we have, by reducing the value of the currency, we have lowered wages in this country from an economic standpoint, so that's good. But on the point of going offshore, we are beginning to see, I think we're going to see less of that now with the currency being lowered. In fact, we're beginning to see factory production and exports pick up in the Midwest, which is very, very good and is going to be something that's going to carry this economy. What you were also talking about, though, is something that's been occurring over the last 10 to 15 years, which is production of parts overseas, goods overseas, and final assembly in this country. I heard one economist tell me recently that we have become a low-wage producer, or the best producer in the world in a number of goods, such as videotapes and things like this. And it's quite a turnaround for the United States. I think it'll take several years for us to regain some of those markets, however.
Fullerton, California. Good morning. Go ahead, please.
Yes, I wanted to ask the gentleman how he felt about the Leo Iacocca plan that he published to reduce the budget deficit. As I recall, it involved a increase in the gasoline tax and an increase in the income tax, and then a budget a reduction of a small amount, and a 3 or 4 step program that over a period of a year or two would simply do away with it.
Thank you.
Well, I don't know specifically about Iacocca's plan. I think a lot of these plans have to be looked at carefully as to details as to what the effect will be on the economy. I think a gasoline tax is not a bad idea as a way to go and cut tax, because it's a consumption tax. It's on a specific commodity. It's something that you can, I mean, only gasoline is very necessary for people to get around and drive the economy in a way. You must admit that a lot of people do a lot of discretionary driving, which could be cut back, and if you raise taxes on that, maybe you could still get some more income. So I think that's a good way. The thing that always worried me about Iacocca and his solutions, he always has a sort of protectionist solution to each one of our problems, and I'm not so sure that that's the right way to go in this day and time. Income tax increase, I don't know, I would look with some askance on that right now. We've just cut taxes. We need a little time to see what happens on that, whether that's going to generate the kind of growth that Reagan is talking about. Maybe some slight increase in income taxes. But I think this will be interesting enough, this will be a big issue next year. when the next president goes into office, will those low rates in the Tax Reform Act, passed in 1986, remain, or will the next president and the next Congress see that as a way to close this revenue gap I've been talking about? So I don't know. There are a lot of plans out there, and I guess we just have to pick and choose.
President Reagan has reopened the debate on the capital gains tax. Economically speaking, what does that mean? Politically speaking, what does it mean?
Well, I think he was sort of running interference for George Bush on the whole issue of the capital gains tax, and the administration doesn't want that to be passed this year because, for the point that I think when you smiled, you realized that if you
I didn't
do
realize
that,
anything. I want to be on record. I didn't realize anything.
if you did that this year, you reopen the whole debate about what the tax rate should be. So the Democrats could come in and say, well, if you're lowering capital gains tax, that's going to mainly help the wealthy since they have most of the capital gains. To balance that off, why don't we raise the tax rates at the top tax rates on the wealthy and bring in more revenue? So that's a big George Bush campaign platform, cutting the capital gains tax to 15% from 28% now. And he says it will generate all kinds of jobs, it will bring in more revenue, not to worry. And I think that's an issue for 1988.
Okay.
I mean 1989, excuse me.
Lubbock, Texas, good morning.
I would like to see a value-added tax on everything but groceries and drugs, and earmark it for nothing but reducing the national deficit.
All right, thank you.
It's one solution, and one solution you hear particularly about a lot of conservative economists. They say the value-added tax increases savings in the country because it's a tax on consumption. Europeans certainly have tried it, and I don't know whether that's really the way to go or not. I would be in favor of anything that sort of increased savings in this country because we've traditionally had a very low savings rate. On the other hand, one thing you've got to remember that if you tax it too heavily, tax consumption too heavily, we need to consume. When we don't want a recession, we've got to be careful what we're doing here. We want to increase savings, but we don't want to increase savings so much that we knock the economy down at the same time. So that has to be a consideration, I think. I don't know. I mean, I guess I'm enough of an American to say we don't necessarily have to copy the Europeans because their tax system hasn't been singularly successful in achieving the economic growth in those countries. I mean, they have real problems there. So maybe we can think of another way to increase savings. Let this other tax reform bill that passed in '86, see what happens to it. It's not that much of a spur to savings, but there have been plans to say let's allow deductions for some of the savings that we have in our savings account. Maybe that's the way to go, as opposed to the. I don't care much for the VAT. Thank you.
Colorado Springs, Colorado. Good morning. Go ahead, please.
Morning.
Good morning.
On the Democrats that keep running for office for president, you know, they keep saying the economy's in bad shape, this and that, and they have to raise taxes to get money to balance the budget. I mean, over the last 5 years, the economy's been growing, things be in good shape. Now, I got money to spend, do what I want, but they keep saying we got to raise taxes. And every time you raise taxes, they just spend more. Taxes, spend, taxes, spend. I mean, what this got, or how is this going to affect the economy? I mean, you know, it's in good shape. Everybody says it is. They keep saying it's in bad shape. Sooner or later, they got to hit it. You just play the numbers long enough.
All right, thanks.
Got two economies out there, haven't you? One, a Democratic economy and a Republican economy. And I think the real economy is probably somewhere in between. I'm not quite sure where it is precisely, but gentleman raises a good point. In an election year, you get all this gloom and doom on one side, which is what you expect the Democrats to do, and the Republicans say everything's hunky-dory. Well, I think I come down somewhere in the middle. The stock market crash indicates to me that there's something fundamentally wrong here. The budget deficit really is out of line. Trade deficit's really too high, that we are mortgaging our future to some extent. I don't know whether I'd go all the way, as some of the Democrats have been saying, you know, we're going down the tubes fast, because this is a big, productive, innovative economy, much more innovative than the European economies, maybe not quite as innovative as the Japanese, but we're not that bad. So I'm going to play the game of politician with the gentleman this morning and kind of go right down the middle and say, you know, I don't agree with either side. I think there's a third economy than one I see, and one we see probably.
Topeka, Kansas. Go ahead, please. You're on the air.
Yes, I'm calling from Topeka, and I'd like to
suggest a possible solution that I think would help our economy. And that is, whenever business is in trouble, they enact some kind of tax incentives for business. I think they ought to use the tax incentive for jobs to put Americans to work. I think if they charged everyone that did business in the American market a tax and then discounted the tax by the income taxes of the company's employees, it would be unprofitable for business to do business without having the employees pay and pay them good wages.
All right, Topeka, thank you.
Well, one of the principles of the tax reform bill, 1986, was to make the tax system neutral, take away a lot of these incentives, both for businesses and for workers. And I personally think that's a good idea. Just take the tax system out of it totally, let the economy run basically in its own resources, and see what happens. That's a stronger faith in capitalism, and I think I favor that approach, making the tax system neutral. So anytime you say we want tax incentives, what you're saying is we want our particular problem put on the back of all the taxpayers, and we want to have all these incentives and tax breaks, and I don't go along with that approach.
Tucson, Arizona, you're next.
Yes. I'm very interested in historical amnesia, that we need to investigate what has happened before so that we don't repeat it. In Eugene Mullen's book on the secrets of the Federal Reserve, back in 1913, the New York Times front page was a money bill, maybe law today, where they pushed through the Federal Reserve bill like has happened this last year with President Reagan. And that was called the Christmas Massacre. I think we need to go back and find out exactly about the Federal Reserve and what part it plays in our economy. They said as the result of this back in 1930, it really brought on the Depression. Recently with Black Monday. Let's see what history can tell us about it. And thank you very much. I really enjoy C-SPAN.
Thank you.
Well, 1913 was when the Federal Reserve Act was passed and the Fed was created, of course. Well, we alluded to this point earlier, whether the Fed actually caused the stock market crash. And many who felt that this was probably the case, that the Fed was extremely tight during the fall and held money pretty close to zero growth for a number of weeks. Right when Greenspan went in there, because they were worried about inflationary fears, and bam, when you saw interest rates going up, you saw the stock market collapse. And then the Fed instantly injected a lot of money directly into the economy and recreated confidence, so to speak. I mean, it just flooded the economy with money right after the crash for any number of weeks. And then it began to tighten up again. Once you put all that money out there, you're raising some inflationary fears if you keep it out there forever. And there are some who say over the last several weeks it's kept money too tight, relatively speaking, and that's the reason, back to the beginning of this program, we were talking about what the Fed may be doing now because of fears of recession coming up. Fed's a very important institution. It's sort of a rationer of credit and money to the economy. It tries to gauge how much money it needs to put in for a period of weeks ahead to keep the economy growing but without inflation. This is sort of it's not a science, more of an art these days than anything else. It always has been an art to know precisely how much to put in. And it works through the open market system, through the banking system. And so I think we have to watch it very closely because it affects the supply of money, and to some extent it also affects the demand for money, because by lowering the price of it.
This is the money page of USA Today. The cover story focuses on the Senate banking hearings starting today on the stock market crash. Senate takes stock. Hearing starts today on market crash with some of the key players: John Phelan, David Reuter, Nicholas Brady. What can we expect to come out of these hearings? What can Congress actually do?
Well, I think the real issue here is whether we're going to have any regulation on these markets. And in particular, we're going to have any regulation on the futures market in Chicago? And possibly, are we going to have any further regulation on the way that the New York Stock Exchange sort of interacts with the futures market with the use of so-called program trading, and with I mean, it's a very complicated situation, but in Chicago they have the futures markets, and you can actually buy contracts in the futures price for the Standard & Poor's 500 and buy that, say, 60, 90 days ahead of time. And so the people in New York with their computers actually instantaneously trade back and forth between these two markets and get the best possible deal. And this, in some people's mind, this institutional trading has created the volatility that we've seen the market grow in the last several years. So I think what we'll see out of this is a real debate, real tension for more regulation, with the administration saying we don't want more regulation, Brady saying maybe more regulation is needed. Senate banking, I think, will opt for more regulation, probably. But as to what will happen, I don't know. I think it'll be fairly modest in this election year.
Indianapolis, good morning.
Good morning. I'm watching you from my... Is this a feedback?
Yeah, it is a feedback if you're getting an echo, so just turn your set down quickly. We don't have a lot of time. Indianapolis?
Yes. I just want to tell you how much I enjoy C-SPAN. It's the window to my world, and I think it's one of the greatest things that we've got going for us now.
Thank you.
And I appreciate the fact that we get to see as much as we get to see, because all of us should watch this, definitely, because you give us everything we need to know, and very unbiased, and that's the greatest thing that you've got going for you. And the one thing on this economy, you hear, this, that, and the other, but we have just gotten our tax for this year, the forms and everything, and if this is supposed to be a simplified tax, I've got news for you. My husband and I are both going bonkers over this, because you have to call in for this form and that form and some other form, and they talk about the American people wanting to save money. Well, we're in the middle income bracket. Okay, so we can't take the IRAs anymore. So, I mean, you can only get so much of a % off of this. We not only can't do that, but year after year, we have to pay taxes on our interest that we get from our CDs we have. Now, we don't make over $55,000 a year. Now, if they want us to save money, then why can't we pay interest once on that? Because we have to pay taxes on that before we put it in the bank to begin with. And that would give the feds more money to spend, because if we've got CDs, we can only take them out when they're done.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
Well, they didn't do that. And that's one of the problems with tax reform, I guess, in a way. I don't see Congress going back to this for a while, so I'm not offering any hope to the lady. I think they're going to let it sit for a while and maybe re-examine it in a few more years. She's right. This was not tax simplification, but it did lower the tax rates. They took away your IRA deduction naturally, and you still tax defer it, but you don't have that deduction when you buy your IRA, that's for sure. But the tax rates are lower, and they're going to be lower again next year. So you trade off one for the other.
Portland, Oregon is next. Good morning.
Yeah, good morning. I would like to ask the gentleman if he sees these times as similar to the Industrial Revolution, that machines replaced people, and now we have a technology that's changing, and for instance, Dukakis in Massachusetts has MIT that is, helping the economy of that state, in California and Silicon Valley. I just wondered if he might think that the universities should start training, their students to be in a different type of, to adjust to the new economy. In other words, running these computers and things like that. And also, I wanted to ask him what he thought of Babbitt's national sales tax. Thank you.
Thank you.
On private sales tax, I think it's 5%. It seems a little steep to me. I don't know if you want to have a sale. I mean, I spoke against a VAT earlier, so I'm not. I don't think I'm in favor of sales tax that broad. Maybe a gasoline tax would be something a little more limited. Could raise the kind of revenue that we're talking about. And the other question again was on?
Was adjusting to a new type of economy.
Oh,
Is this
yes.
the equivalent of the Industrial Revolution?
Oh, yes. Well, yes, I think so, as a matter of fact. It's equivalent to a large extent to that. I'll make one comment. I don't think we have managed technology very well in this country. And I think that's one of our big problems. As to whether it's a net producer of jobs or a net reducer of jobs, I don't know the answer to that question. I think that probably it balances out over time. When you have some people thrown out of work and say in the factory, well, we tend to build more higher value-added jobs in the services sector that support the production of goods. We don't want to lose our manufacturing. That's key, and that's why we have to make it more efficient. There'll be fewer jobs in manufacturing. So that's the way we raise our productivity in this country. And yes, I think we have to train workers differently, and I think the universities in particular need to wake up to this fact, and I don't think they have as yet. I'm not saying the university should be training grounds necessarily for sort of vocational educational schools or anything like that, but I don't think they have yet awakened to the fact that we are living in a new world.
Hammond, Louisiana, good morning.
Good morning. One phase of this discussion, which I had thought was very important, hasn't been touched on, I believe. That is the very large percentage of our national debt that is being financed abroad. I have heard it said in some of the political debates that the Fed no longer completely controls our interest rates, as the discussion has indicated up to now that they do. That it is being driven in large measure by our great need for financing our debt abroad. I'm probably asking you an unfair question, since you do not hold yourself as an economist, but only a astute observer. How far down can interest rates go before we dry up a significant part of that investment in our borrowing? And how much borrowing can our government